September 1974, Pahang State, Malaysia. 47 men trying to push 12 miles of road through highland jungle, so old the survey teams had mapped it differently every time they tried. Then, on a Tuesday in the second week of October, the first man disappeared along a flagging line 400 meters into the corridor. The jungle gave him back 3 days later, and he couldn't account for the time between. By the third week, we had learned to count our crew twice at sundown. By the sixth, we had stopped counting and started packing. This is what happened during the 41 days our crew spent on the highland stretch the contractors called Survey Section 4, before we drove out at first light and never came back. Subscribe for more historical horror stories. I was 38 years old when the Pacific Engineering Group contracted me as a roadworks consultant out of Portland, Oregon. The pay was $420 a week, which was better than anything the municipal offices back home were offering that year. They needed someone who had done switchback-grade work in difficult terrain, and I had 2 years on mountain highway projects in the Philippines behind me. I flew into Kuala Lumpur on September 9th, 1974, spent 2 days reviewing topographic surveys in a company office, and then they loaded me into a Land Rover and drove me northeast into the Titiwangsa mountain range. The paved road ended about 30 miles outside the city, and the laterite mud began, and it didn't improve for the next 4 hours of climbing into the highlands. The site camp sat at roughly 2,000 feet elevation, carved out of primary jungle along the survey corridor. 3 main structures: a long canvas-sided mess hall, a corrugated metal equipment shed, and a lumber bunkhouse they'd hauled in on flatbeds. Beyond those, a dozen smaller tents for survey teams and local workers. Everything smelled of diesel fuel, red mud, and something green and rotting underneath all of it. The site foreman met me at the camp gate, which was 2 oil drums and a length of chain strung between them. He was Malaysian Chinese, mid-40s, built like a tree stump, with close-cropped hair and a scar running the full length of his left forearm that he never once explained. He wore his hard hat, even during dinner. He shook my hand and told me the previous consulting engineer, a man from England, had left 6 weeks early due to a family emergency. That was the official word. I heard the other word that first evening from a Scottish surveyor who had been on site since July. He was tall, red-faced from the altitude and the heat, with wire-rimmed glasses and a tobacco pipe he kept in his breast pocket even when it wasn't lit. He told me quietly over tinned coffee that the English engineer had not gone home for family reasons. He'd gone home because he'd stopped sleeping entirely and had begun writing the same phrase on every sheet of graph paper in the office tent. The surveyor wouldn't tell me what the phrase was. I didn't push. I set up my cot in the bunkhouse, took a plate of rice and fish from the cook, and went to bed at 9 o'clock. The jungle was louder than I had expected. Not threatening, just the accumulated sound of 10,000 living things conducting their business in the dark. I lay on the cot and told myself it was no different from the Philippine sights, and I believed it enough to fall asleep. I should describe the terrain before I go any further. The section of highland we were cutting through had no name on the government survey maps. The contractors called it Section 4. The local workers called it something in Malay that the foreman translated for me as the place the forest keeps. He said it without inflection, the way you state the load capacity of a culvert or the drainage coefficient of a slope. A technical datum. The Orang Asli had inhabited these hills for longer than Malaysia had existed as a country. A small settlement sat about 8 miles east of our site, and the company had contracted 3 men from that settlement to serve as jungle guides. The oldest of these was slight and of indeterminate age, somewhere between 60 and 80, who wore no shoes regardless of the terrain. He had teeth stained dark from betel nut, and he moved through the jungle the way water moves through rock. The foreman told me his name, and I will write it here as Pak Dowd, which is close enough to what I remember. The first week of work was ordinary. We were cutting approach grades and laying sub-base on the lower section, standard switchback engineering through difficult terrain. I walked the survey corridor twice daily, logged my measurements, communicated recommendations through the foreman, and ate at the long table in the mess hall with the rest of the crew. Nothing distinguished those first 7 days from any other remote site job I had done. On the morning of September 24th, before the work whistle, Pak Dowd was waiting outside the bunkhouse. He had never sought me out before. He spoke in Malay, and the foreman translated his words over breakfast. There were places in the corridor where the ground had been walked by things that were present before the forest itself was a forest. These places were not marked visibly but by weight. You felt it when you crossed them. He had felt 3 such places in the survey corridor. He wanted to know if we could route around them. I thanked him through the foreman and explained that the corridor was fixed by the government survey and couldn't be altered without ministry approval from Kuala Lumpur. That was true. It was also the kind of truth that sounds rational in an engineering office and feels considerably less rational when you're standing in highland jungle at 2,000 feet with a man who has lived in this terrain his entire life and is telling you something with great care and some urgency. The first incident I could not explain happened on October 1st. One of the survey crew, a young man who had been with the company for 8 months, failed to return from an afternoon flagging run. A flagging run meant walking a pre-marked compass bearing through the jungle, tying colored tape to tree trunks every 20 meters. He was assigned a 400-meter segment, 2 hours of work at most. By 5 o'clock, he had not come back. The foreman sent 2 men along the flagging line to find him. They came back 40 minutes later. They had found the line running correctly for 360 meters. Then the flags stopped. Not at a clearing, not at an obstruction. Just stopped. The last flag was tied neatly to a tree trunk at the correct height, the tape cut cleanly, and beyond it was unbroken jungle on the correct compass, bearing with no sign of further passage. We searched until dark. The foreman called the halt when the light failed, which was the correct call. Searching primary jungle at night with electric torches is an efficient way to lose more people. We marked our last position, organized a full search for daybreak, and I sat in the mess hall and logged what we knew in the site record. I had taken over maintaining the site log myself by the 2nd week. It gave me something precise to do. The missing man came back on October 4th. He walked into camp at 7 in the morning during breakfast, dirty and somewhat thin, but physically uninjured. No cuts, no signs of animal attack, no broken bones. He sat down at the mess table and ate a full plate of rice. He answered questions directly. He had followed his compass bearing as assigned. The flagging had gone correctly. And then he had sat down against a tree because he felt tired. And then it was morning and he was walking back. He had lost 3 days and a night by that account. He did not seem distressed by this gap. He was, if anything, calmer than a man who had spent 3 nights alone in primary jungle with no food or equipment had any right to be. The company doctor happened to be on site for his bi-weekly visit that morning. He examined the man and found no medical abnormality. I spoke with the man privately afterward, with the foreman interpreting. I asked what he had heard or seen during the 3 days. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had heard singing. I asked what kind of singing. He said it was like a woman's voice, but coming from several directions at once, very far away and very close at the same time. He said this the way a man describes traffic or rainfall, a condition of the environment, not an event. I wrote this in my personal notebook, which I kept separate from the official site log. We were back at full work by October 5th. The foreman made no formal report of the incident to the ministry office in Kuala Lumpur. I did not press him on this. We were 9 days behind schedule, and the contract had a financial penalty structure that activated at 12 days of delay. That is the context you need to understand everything that came after it. On October 9th, the lead bulldozer operator stopped his machine at the 600-meter mark and climbed down to check something in the path of his blade. What he found was a circle of ground approximately 9 feet in diameter, where the vegetation had been compressed flat and pushed outward radially from the center, as if something very heavy had rested there. The depression in the laterite soil at the center was 18 inches deep. The foreman measured it himself, 9 feet, 2 inches across. The compressed vegetation was still green, meaning it had occurred within the previous 24 hours. The soil compaction at the center represented, by the foreman's estimate, something in excess of 800 pounds of applied weight. There were no tracks leading into the circle. There were no tracks leading out. I photographed it with the company's 35mm Canon. I have those photographs still. In 50 years, I have shown them to 3 people. The foreman told the crew a ministry helicopter had made a survey landing there. No ministry survey flight had been scheduled for Section 4. I had access to the coordination calendar, and I knew this, and he knew that I knew. We did not discuss it further. He was maintaining order with the tools available to him. On October 13th, the camp cook went to investigate the supply tent at 3 in the morning, thinking the dogs had gotten into the tinned goods. He came back to the bunkhouse without having investigated. He sat on the edge of his cot and did not sleep again that night. I asked him the following morning what he had seen. He said he hadn't seen anything. He said there was a smell. I asked what kind. He said like river water and old meat, but warm, like it came from something that was breathing. I added this to my personal log. Date, time, witness, exact location, description. By mid-October, I had 17 entries of this kind. Sounds at the perimeter, impressions in the earth, smells with no visible source. One of the work lights on the north side of camp found extinguished 3 mornings running without anyone having touched it. The foreman was aware of all 17 incidents. He continued to offer mechanical or natural explanations for each. On October 18th, the Scottish surveyor came to me after dinner. He set his unlit tobacco pipe on the equipment crate between us and said quietly that he had seen something 2 nights before and had told no one. He'd gone out at midnight to check a plumb line on the upper grade, which was a reasonable thing for a surveyor to do. He'd taken a torch. He said at the outer edge of the torch beam, perhaps 60 feet from where he stood, there was a shape that stood upright. Not an animal outline, not a tree or a cast shadow, an upright shape. Between 7 and 8 feet tall by his estimate, with proportions that were approximately human, but wrong in some way he could not articulate, beyond saying the ratio of limb to torso was incorrect. It was standing completely still. It was watching the camp. He stood with his torch for 30 seconds before he walked back to the bunkhouse. He did not run. He said, "I have been in jungle terrain since 1961. That was something I have never encountered before." I asked whether he wanted to submit a formal report. He said, "No." I asked why. He said if a formal report went to the ministry, the work would be suspended pending investigation. And if the work was suspended, neither of us would be paid for the duration. That is the economy of these situations. That is why the records almost never say what actually happened. On October 21st, Pak Dord came to the foreman and asked to be released from his contract. He was owed 11 days of remaining pay. The foreman offered to pay him the full balance if he would stay one more week. Pak Dord declined, accepted 2/3 of what he was owed in cash, and left with his 2 younger guides before noon. I walked with him to the edge of camp while the foreman handled the paperwork. I asked him, in my limited Malay, what he had decided. He looked at me with the patience of a man explaining something to a child who does not yet have the vocabulary for the full answer. He said 3 words. I understood 2 of them, old and hungry. The third I looked up later in a language reference at the KL office. It translated as both waiting and watching, depending on context. By October 24th, the incidents we had been averaging at 3 per night became 5. The camp dogs had stopped eating. The cook reported that milk purchased in town 3 days prior had gone solid overnight despite the cool temperature. The generator on the north perimeter misfired twice without mechanical pause, cutting the work lights for intervals of 3 to 8 seconds at a stretch. On the night of October 26th, at 1:15 in the morning, I heard a vocalization. I want to be precise about this, and I want to be honest that precision fails me here. It was in the frequency range of human sound. It had a pattern that resembled the rhythm of speech. It was not speech as I understand speech, and it was not any animal vocalization I have encountered in 20 years of outdoor fieldwork. It came from the northern tree line. It lasted 8 minutes by my watch. It did not vary in intensity or direction. It neither approached nor receded. When it stopped entirely without fade, in the way a recording stops rather than the way a living sound dies. 3 seconds after it stopped, the camp dogs began barking. That 3-second interval is the detail that has stayed with me most across the years, because it suggests the sound was not in a register the dogs could process in the ordinary way. The foreman was awake. The surveyor was awake. Most of the camp was awake. At breakfast the following morning, no one brought it up. That silence was its own kind of answer. You could see the accounting happening behind every man's face, the wages owed against the weeks remaining, the calculation that kept 47 men in those tents instead of in their cars. On October 28th, we found the second circle. It was at the 800-meter mark of the corridor, 40 feet into the uncleared jungle on the west side of the cut. A member of the timber clearing crew found it and called the foreman, and the foreman called me. This circle was larger than the first, 12 feet across by measurement. The same radial compression of vegetation, the same central depression, this 123 inches deep and accompanied by a cracked quality to the laterite soil at the center, as if the weight had been applied with sudden rather than gradual force. And this time there were marks at the eastern edge of the circle. 3 parallel indentations, each approximately 4 inches wide, spaced 8 inches apart, running roughly 14 inches into the compressed soil. The foreman measured them. He said sun bear. He said this with a face that did not believe what it was saying. I photographed the marks. The surveyor looked at them briefly and said, quietly, that sun bears do not produce pressure indentations at that spacing and that depth. Then he walked back to the cut and resumed his survey work. November 1st. The cook made a special dinner of chicken and rice, his version of a celebration for the calendar turning. 3 men did not come to eat. They had found something on the south perimeter fence during the afternoon shift change. 4 metal supply hooks bent outward at a consistent angle. The wire between them stretched but unbroken. The fence post on that section leaning 3 degrees out of vertical. The bend pattern was consistent with pressure applied from outside the perimeter. Something had gripped the wire between the hooks with both hands and pushed outward steadily, testing the resistance. Not breaking it, testing it. The distinction matters. There is a significant difference between a thing that destroys barriers and a thing that examines them. Something had been assessing the boundary of the camp. By November 4th, 6 men had refused to work the north and west sections of the cut. The foreman reassigned them to maintenance and interior supply work. He did not discipline them. He did not explain the reassignment in writing. He simply moved them and continued. This is how people who are paid to maintain order actually maintain it in situations like this. You accommodate what you cannot control, and you do not give it a name. On November 7th at 6 o'clock in the evening, I saw it. I was at the survey equipment station on the east side of camp, logging afternoon-grade measurements. The equatorial twilight was going fast, 10 minutes of real dusk before genuine dark. My torch was clipped to my belt, not yet switched on. I was writing in my notepad when the jungle on the slope above me went silent. Not gradually. The frogs, the insects, the birds, the constant accumulated noise of that forest, all of it stopped in the same moment, as if someone had cut a wire. I've been in jungle environments long enough to know what large animal silence sounds like. A single big animal moving through forest will silence it in a wave, the alarm spreading outward from the animal's position. This was not that. Everything stopped simultaneously from every direction at once. I looked up the slope. It was at the tree line, 80 feet from where I stood, approximately. It was standing partially behind a tree, which was a secondary growth dipterocarp I had measured that week at 17 feet. The thing's upper portion cleared the crown of that tree. I could see the silhouette against the sky that remained above the canopy. I cannot give you dimensions with precision because the light was failing. What I can tell you is the scale implied. It had eyes that caught light. I don't mean they glowed. I mean they reflected the remaining ambient light the way the eyes of large cats reflect light, a flat returned quality. 2 points of dim reflected light at a height consistent with the rest of what I was estimating. They were oriented toward me, toward the camp behind me, toward the whole of what we had built in its territory. I did not move. It did not move. That lasted for close to a minute. Then, one of the camp dogs barked somewhere on the far side of camp, and I looked toward the sound for 1 second, and when I looked back at the tree line, there was nothing there. Not gone in any way I perceived, simply absent where it had been. The jungle sounds returned all at once in the same instantaneous way they had stopped. I walked back to camp. I ate dinner. I wrote 4 paragraphs in my personal log with precise measurements and estimates. Then I went to the foreman's tent. I told him what I had seen. I gave him my honest estimate of the dimensions involved. He listened without expression. When I finished, he said, "How long do you need to secure the survey data and prepare the equipment for transport?" I said 4 days if we pushed. He said 3. We spent November 8th through 10th in what the official site log records as a planned equipment consolidation and preliminary demobilization due to unforeseen geological assessment requirements. That is what the log says. What we actually did was organize every piece of equipment and every man's belongings for removal in a single convoy movement. On the night of November 10th, the last night in Section 4, the pattern changed. At 11:30, it began to circle the camp. Not the tree line at a distance, not the perimeter with testing pressure on the wire. It moved around the camp itself at a distance of approximately 20 to 30 feet from the outermost structures, and it did not stop, and it was not quiet. The footfalls were audible, deliberate, slow, evenly spaced. The circuit took 11 minutes each time. We know this because the Scottish surveyor counted them. Sitting with his back against the corrugated metal wall of the equipment shed, his transit log open on his knees, making one small tick mark for each completed circuit. He counted to 14 before I told him to stop. 14 circuits, 2 hours and 34 minutes. Then it stopped. Not withdrew, not departed into the jungle in any audible or perceptible way, stopped the way silence stops when a presence enters a room. The jungle sounds returned, all at once again, and the camp dogs uncurled themselves from against the bunkhouse wall. And 23 men sat in the equipment shed until 4 in the morning because there was nothing else that felt reasonable to do. At 4 o'clock I went to my cot for 2 hours. I did not sleep. I listened to the ordinary sounds of the jungle, and I performed the accounting that I had been performing every night for 6 weeks. What I had seen, what I had measured, what I could confirm with a second witness. We left on November 11th, 1974. At 6:30 in the morning, 44 men and 3 vehicles, 1 Land Rover, 1 equipment truck, 1 flatbed carrying what survey instruments and personal effects could be moved in a single load. The foreman drove the Land Rover. I sat in the passenger seat with my notebooks on my lap. The surveyor rode in the flatbed cab, 12 miles of red laterite road to the first paved surface, then 4 hours down the mountain to Kuala Lumpur. Nobody spoke much in those 12 miles. When we hit the asphalt of the state road, the foreman exhaled once through his nose, long and controlled, and shifted gears. That was the extent of what passed between us in acknowledgement of the previous 41 days. Men who work in dangerous places develop a shared understanding about what requires words and what does not. The site log records Survey Section 4 as completed to preliminary grade specification, suspended pending geological assessment due to slope instability concerns in the upper corridor. That assessment was never conducted. A different contractor resumed the work from the opposite end of the section 17 months later with a completely new crew. The highway opened on schedule in 1977. I flew back to Portland, Oregon on November 19, 1974. I took a position with the Municipal Engineering Office in December and did not accept another overseas field contract for 11 years. When I eventually did, I made certain the terrain was desert. I know what became of most of the men who were with us. The cook opened a small restaurant in Ipoh. One of the survey crew completed a civil engineering degree and spent 3 decades with the same firm. The foreman retired in 1991, and I know this because he sent me a letter that year, a short letter, mostly ordinary information about nothing in particular. At the end, he wrote, "I trust you kept your notes." I wrote back, "Yes." He did not write again. The Scottish surveyor went home to Glasgow. I heard from him once through a mutual colleague in the late 1980s. He was, well, had retired from field work. The transit log with the 14 tick marks, I have never learned what became of it. I hope it's in a box somewhere. I hope someone eventually finds it. I'm 81 years old now. I live in Astoria on the Oregon coast. The forest comes close to the house here, Douglas fir and Sitka spruce running right down to the edge of the property. And on nights when the mountain wind comes off the coast range, I find myself still performing the same accounting I performed in Section 4. What I observed, what I documented, what I can confirm with an outside witness and a measurement. People who know the Karak Highway know the stories, the yellow car that drives itself on the mountain road in the early hours, the woman who appears in headlights and is gone when the car slows, the children at the roadside in the deep part of the night. I have my own understanding of what these accounts describe. I will keep that understanding to myself. What I will say is that 47 men entered Section 4 in September of 1974, and 44 of them came back out. And the 3 who did not were the 3 who had known enough to leave on their own terms weeks before us. The tradition in those highlands calls it Orang Bunian, the people of the forest who are not visible. Stories of them go back centuries before the first survey stake was ever driven in those mountains. The accounts follow a consistent pattern across every generation that has recorded them. They return, they assess, they wait. What does not vary across any of the accounts is the territorial nature of what is described. I know what I measured. I know what I photographed. I know what I wrote in the personal log that still sits in a cardboard box in the room next to the one I'm writing this in now. I know that the 3 Orang Asli guides who told us what we were building across left us 3 weeks before we finally understood it ourselves. I know that 44 men drove away from Section 4 on a November morning, and that none of them looked back. The forest always wins.